Certainly exciting for me to be here. It's great to be with a Harvard man by my side. I feel a little more comfortable being a Stanford guy. And that was, when I got the call from Dimitri, I immediately thought of bringing Evan for, a whole bunch of reasons. Number one, he was a Harvard guy. Apparently not Harvard Business School, which is like a completely different universe from Harvard College, so I understand this now. But I also knew he'd be able to tell me where the best pizza in town was, and we found it last night at Regina's. So that was mission accomplished number one. Secondly, I invited him because he is the chairman, and so he controls my compensation. And so, I grew up in the generation where greed was good. I don't know if that's the case anymore. So, but that's also very important. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also invited him because, I'm so lucky to be a part of this company. And it really, if you look at where we're at today, this is the first cloud company, modern cloud company. And certainly when Evan started the company and when I joined in 2002, nobody believed that this would happen, that people would actually be running their businesses on, the internet, what we call the cloud today. And in fact, I think the big thing that's changed since Evan founded the company is it's not just tech companies that are cloud companies now. Every company is a cloud company. If you look at what's going on in every industry, banking, we were just talking about it, Dimitri and I, about some of the things that are happening in banking and his belief that banking is going to shift to Silicon Valley from New York. Banks are, this is the home of disruption, but this is really a huge disruptive trend that's transforming every industry. How do you leverage this ubiquitous network to reach customers in ways that they want to be reached, right? Everybody wants a consumer-like experience, whether they're interacting with Facebook or with NetSuite. So it's amazing that the 5-minute conversation that Evan's going to talk to you about with Larry Ellison has fundamentally changed the world. And those of you that are entrepreneurs are always talking about changing the world. We really never talk about changing the world at NetSuite, but it's pretty cool to have been a part of a massive change in the world called the cloud. And the final reason I invited Evan was certainly from my perspective, I never dreamed I'd be a CEO of a publicly traded company. And so being invited by Evan to join his company as CEO, I think is perhaps one of the more interesting aspects of certainly what we do. But if you look at many of the most successful companies on the planet, while you think of an individual at Oracle, you think of Larry Ellison, or at Apple, you think of Steve Jobs. It was really small teams of people that actually started those companies in many cases and made them great. Jobs had Wozniak. Hewlett had Packard. That was probably one of the longest running partnerships. Larry Ellison actually had Bob Miner, who Evan worked for, who was sort of the technology, he was the technology leader at Oracle. And we're different in the sense that I came in after the founding, and we've had an amazing run together. And so I think that's philosophically one of the most interesting things about certainly NetSuite and my involvement with it is, how do you have two talented people combine their individual skills to make something pretty cool happen? So, so those are some of the topics that I thought, certainly we might cover today. Just for those of you that aren't necessarily familiar with NetSuite, we do make ERP software. My sister calls it ERP software. It's not the sexiest business in the world, unless you like the world of business, because at the end of the day, ERP software is the heart of every company. It is the system that people run their business on. And so lots of software companies have grown in the cloud industry. Some grow faster than others. Salesforce grew very quickly, as an example. We've been growing very steadily over the years. Certainly over the last 4 years, our growth has accelerated. We're probably the only software company where you actually see revenue acceleration over the last 4 years. And the interesting thing when you look at business software is, ultimately, what does the business application do? When we first started this business, everybody sort of lumped cloud applications together. But Salesforce does something very different than NetSuite, and I summarize it to my sister, who calls it ERP software. We're the heart transplant. When somebody goes to move off of SAP or off of Oracle onto NetSuite, the patient can actually die. And in fact, you look at SAP implementations and they do die. Where other applications, Salesforce, great application, don't get me wrong, it's a knee replacement, right? If you change your sales software and it doesn't work, the patient's not going to die. So you see different growth rates accordingly, but you also see, I think, different longevity depending on the type of application you're building, and ultimately the core data that your application owns. At the end of the day, SAP won, not Siebel. Why was that the case? Well, SAP owned the data that was most important to running a business. Siebel did not. And so as you look at, if those of you that are interested in business applications and enterprise software, and either building new companies or joining existing companies, the longevity of the company, it really is defined often by what is the core data that application is capturing and enabling companies to use. And in the case of NetSuite, it's the core business software. The other interesting thing, and I'll get to this a little bit more after Evan speaks, is the transition that we've made over time from selling the application to small and mid-sized businesses to now also selling it to very large companies. And that's a pretty key strategic change. Not really a change, but an addition we made to our strategy over time that is an interesting point. Certainly up on this screen, you see a lot of companies' names that you know. In our history, that hasn't been the case. When we'd go out and we went public in 2007, people would say, who are some of your customers? And we'd name all these mid-sized companies that nobody's ever heard of, right? The Fortune 5 million, not the Fortune 500. But the Fortune 5 million is really an interesting marketplace, right? And most companies get built around the Fortune 500 because at the end of the day, it's easier to sell to 500 companies than it is to sell to 5 million companies. How do you sell to 500 companies? You go hire 500 sales reps. How do you sell to 5 million companies? It's really hard, especially when you're delivering to them a complex mission-critical application like NetSuite. And so I think some of the interesting things we've done to crack the code on selling to small businesses as well as large businesses is sort of an interesting thing that we've experienced over time. This has been our journey. I joined in 2002. If we went back to 1998, I think the number was $0 million in revenue when Evan started. And I think I never claim to be a founder of the company because I think it's very different to start something from nothing, and even joining when it's $3 million in revenue. To me, it's much easier to join at $3 million than it was at 0. Evan's incredibly talented and has founded several companies. It's a special skill to start companies, but it's been a lot of fun going from 3 to 553 or so that we're expected to do this year. The other thing that's interesting to watch, and this is where market share is where you see the transition from existing software to the next generation. We've grown at 41.6% over the last year in terms of market share growth. If we put SAP and Oracle and sort of the other legacy vendors on there, they're not growing at all. And so while people think it's sort of funny that we position against SAP there, I don't know how much bigger they are than we are, billions of dollars bigger. But you can tell through market share shifts where the customer is betting the future is, and these growth rates are really where you measure the disruption of something like NetSuite, enabling next generation business models to exist. So that's where we are today. We're going to do a Brechtian thing. We started at the end or started at the beginning of the end, where we are today. I'm going to hand it over to Evan really to start about the beginning. These are the 4 guys back in 1998 with their 40s.
I think that's a reenactment.
That's a reenactment, actually, yeah. But I'll let him tell you what happened above the liquor store next to the hair salon.
Thanks, Zach. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for everybody for coming early on a Saturday morning after Halloween. So yeah, it started all when I was a small child. No. So I was at Oracle for when I got out of Harvard. I scampered out to California and worked at Oracle for a few years, and then I started my own company, which was kind of always my dream when I was younger, is start a company to sell software and build software and sell software. And but we were kind of flatlining. I was having some trouble making payroll. It was a company that built web design or software for web designers. I worked with Larry at Oracle, and he helped me out a little bit in the background for what he called my graphic stuff. And so I call, the whole company really did start in a 5-minute phone conversation, as Zach alluded to. I don't know if Larry called me, I think, as it were. He always manages to call like at the most inopportune times. Please hold for Larry Ellison. No. So he said, how's it going? And I said, well, it's pretty rough. We have, it's really tough competition. Macromedia kind of owns our customer base. And so I was thinking maybe I'd want to shift gears. And so one of the things that I'd sort of learned from running my own company was the sort of dearth of good business software for smaller companies. And we had QuickBooks on one PC that, you could only get to the financial data of the company if the person using that PC was not surfing the web at the time. as that's an old term. Do you still say surf the web? I don't.
Were they even surfing the web in I guess they were in 1998.
Yeah. So, and we had Yahoo stores to sell on the web. It was completely disintegrated, not integrated with QuickBooks. Support was being done via email. Sales was being done by this like homegrown Access database. We had like 10 different customer lists. It was incredibly difficult to get good information about the business. I imagined that bigger companies had great software to do that. I've learned over the subsequent 16 years that not so much. But so I said to Larry, I said, I kind of want to get involved maybe in business software and selling to small businesses, entrepreneurs like me, and giving them a system that really kind of helps them run their business. And Larry said, well, you know what? If I were doing a business right now, I would do accounting for small companies. I don't think Intuit's going to do it for years and years. As a web-based application. He said, you got to build it on the web. These companies, this is going to be a multi-user database application. They can't manage Oracle and computers and the like. So you want to build it on the web. And he'd already been doing some stuff with Oracle on that. And to me, that was certainly sort of, from our perspective, kind of a seminal moment when, he said, make your software run on the web, start with accounting, because I responded and I said, well, I really wanted to do sales software, because I'm really interested in who we're going to sell to and how much we're going to sell to them. And he said, oh yeah, you'll want to do sales, so you'll want to do the front office stuff after you've done the back office stuff, but you need to start with accounting, because that's the core of the company's data, as Zach mentioned, and that has your customers and your items or your products that you're selling, or your services that you're selling. And he said, oh, and you'll also want to do a web store, and then you'll also want to handle their email. So that was the one thing that he wasn't quite prescient about. But yeah, we did ultimately, and he said, you'll really want to build a suite. And that's actually was his exact words. So I like to say I put the idea in his head of a suite, but most of the company was definitely Larry's idea. I'd say I'd get 30% credit or something like that to get 70. But then he put in $1 million, and I had completely run out of money from my first company, so I put in 2,000. So that's not exactly how the stock was divided up. But no, Larry always was incredibly generous and treated me very well. So I said, okay, and we basically flipped the switch and moved from doing multimedia web software to accounting software, which I knew basically absolutely nothing about. And I had to go out like the first day and go buy an accounting textbook. At that point, it probably would have been good if I'd gone to business school and at least had to take the accounting class. My passion had always been to build systems that made it easy to work with data and kind of give power and ease together. And I think we ended up sort of doing that at NetSuite. And a lot of the company's success has been because we've given all these great tools for customers to adapt their business system very quickly to their circumstances. But really, the number one determinant of success for us, I think, has been that besides the people, of course, has then been that we stayed very true to our vision. Other than the fact that our vision then maybe was 5 million companies paying us $50 a month, and maybe now it's 50 companies paying us $5 million a month. But other than that, it's exactly the same. And so, we put our heads down and built exactly what Larry talked about. We called the company NetLedger, sort of missing that we really wanted to build an entire suite. We were very focused on having a product and a company and a product name that people could relate to. And what we built first was the accounting. But subsequently, I was running the company as CEO, and I have another slide here, which, there's me steering Larry's first boat, and he's advising me not to run it aground, which was pretty much what he was telling me about NetLedger at the time, also, and because I put a lot of money into both of them. The first few years of the company, we were very focused on getting the technology out, and that was a great time. I was CEO. As we started to actually get customers using it, and we had to build a sales organization, I really determined at that point that I sort of wanted to be more Mr. Inside, and I kind of needed a Mr. Outside, and I guess I'm a little more of an introvert. So I got an extrovert. And no, I really, my wife would always say, Evan hates being CEO. He's got to find he's got to find somebody. But really, if I look at my career, I really had been looking for a partner all along, because I always knew that, for me anyway, I felt like my success would derive from combining forces with someone that could really tell the story very effectively and help market and sell the technology that I developed. So it was the 5-minute phone conversation that started the company was very similar. It was like the 5-minute interview with Zach, where I was absolutely sure he was the right candidate for the job, and it was kind of like, I guess, business love at first sight. And so so Zach came on. He says he's not a founder, but that period of time, which I guess was about 3.5 years or so, it seems like about a week now in my memory. We did do a lot of things. I'll tell one other little anecdote is that when my original vision was, when we thought about having a suite or kind of really a single application to run a business, I thought you'd want to be able to see all in one place all the key information, because that's really what I was missing in my previous company, is I had to go to 5 different places to get information, and sometimes it would be contradictory. But we started by building the accounting software, and then we added CRM capabilities. Interestingly, just as a side note, Mark Benioff came to me about 3 months later, because we'd worked together at Oracle, and he said, "Oh yeah, I'm starting a company. It's going to be sales software on the internet for small businesses." Like, where did you hear that one from? And sure enough, Larry was an early investor there. And so, we built the CRM, and we built accounting, and we built a web store. And so we had kind of all the information there, but we still didn't have one place that you could go to get it. So we came out with something in 2001 called the Executive Dashboard, and we did a press release. Even before Zach was there, we would do a press release like once a week. And so Larry saw the press release, and he called me up and he said, "Okay, now you have something I actually want to use. I want to get a login to NetSuite's instance of NetSuite." We were using our own technology to run our business. And so I gave him a login, and then he proceeded to basically become the product manager of the Executive Dashboard. I mean, he completely revamped it. He said, "Here's the graphs you need. You need a drop down so you can quickly change from looking at different period comparisons." And I would go and dutifully code it and send him an email a day later. "Oh, here it is." And back then we could just kind of push stuff out to customers, and it's already in the product. Just log in, you'll see it again. He loved that. So that was really an exciting time where Larry actually got deeply involved, sort of in the product. And so then 2002, Zach came along, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'll talk a little bit about post 2002. I think, as you moved whatever it was from 3 million to 500 million, I always thought NetSuite was going to be a huge company, which is kind of, I guess if you're a founder, you always believe that's the case. But when I had been at McAfee before I came to NetSuite, and my last 2 jobs at McAfee were actually taking our products and turning them into internet services. We did something called McAfee.com, which was taking our B2C antivirus software and actually delivering it over the internet. And I ran a company called MyCIO.com, which was a B2B version of the McAfee.com product. And having done that, I realized very quickly that that's how all software was going to be delivered. It was just so much easier for the customer to consume it. Client-server software was dead. So I left McAfee, and I really had sort of 5 requirements for my next job. One was that it was, I don't even know what it was called back in 2002. Probably was called Software as a Service, maybe ASP. It had to be web-native business software. Number 2, it had to have the company had to have great funding, because if you remember 2002, it was after 2001, which was after 2000, which was the death of all software businesses, right? The first big .com crash. So I wanted to make sure the company was well funded. Number 3, I wanted to make sure it had customers, because the .com crash was all about actually not having customers. Number 4, I wanted to make sure it had a great development team, because at McAfee we had really good ideas. We didn't have necessarily the greatest developers to implement it. And number 5, I wanted to be close to home, because I never really wanted to work again. I didn't think I'd ever find a job close to home. Met with Evan in the 5-minute conversation. So Evan Goldberg and the team, the great development team from Oracle that I knew well. Larry Ellison was the funding, and great stories about Larry. He was sort of the anti-VC in this period, in the sense of, I can remember 3 years into it, we would double the sales force every year, and we're burning enormous amounts of cash. And I'm like, "Larry, I want to stop doubling the sales force." And he goes, No, it's my money. I want you to burn it." And so, and that was not what VCs were doing in 2002. They were completely pulling their horns in because the world had cratered. And frankly, that's why you see NetSuite and Salesforce ultimately achieving escape velocity, was we were the only guys that had this sort of strange funding mechanism called Larry Ellison.
Well, and another thing about my criteria, besides just wanting to find somebody that I thought would be a great partner, was that it would be someone that Larry could also call. And so Zach was like the longest serving head of marketing at Oracle in history, which that job, it was like a revolving door. I mean, that was the worst job in Silicon Valley, and Zach lasted 4 years. So I was like, okay, Larry obviously likes this guy, and he will call him sometimes instead of just me.
And he does call at the most inopportune times. I could tell you many stories. He must have spies on us or something. Three, it was all cloud, right? It was the first cloud company, so that was pretty amazing. We had 3,000 customers at the time. They were very small. They were so our original pricing strategy, $4.95.
We have 3,001 now.
$4.95 a month. And number 5, it was 3 miles from my house. So my wife's like, "You're going back to work." So it was a great, but it was kind of cool actually to, at that point in your career, be able to define what you thought the future was and actually see it happen. But given that, we made an enormous number of strategic changes between 2002 and today. I mean, one was really sort of defining the target market. And to Evan's credit, while he focused, the original vision of the company, and I remember seeing the slides, was, and the vision thing is so important. I didn't really appreciate the vision thing until I became a CEO. The vision is really what defines the success of the company and the longevity of the company. But Evan's original vision was to help entrepreneurs succeed. And when I joined the company, I thought, boy, that's pretty limiting. It only applies to small businesses. If we're going to scale this thing, we need to serve the needs of lots of companies. And so I bristled a little bit at the concept. But now, that I see actually how companies function, every company has entrepreneurs inside of it. And even the largest companies in the world, they actually look for entrepreneurial bodies to change so that they're more, agile and responsive. And so this whole concept of helping entrepreneurs succeed was not a narrow concept at all. It really applied to all businesses and how all great businesses function, even when they're very large. And so that founding vision was in place when I joined, and that is the most important element, I think, of growing a successful company. I think the moral compass was also in place. How we operated as a business was something Evan had put in place, and that's something very important, I think, too, to the success of the company and the types of people that you attract. But ultimately, we had to make lots of strategic changes on top of that core base. One was as simple as moving from NetLedger, which was the original name of the company, to NetSuite. The company was always, the strategy was always to build a suite, but NetLedger really didn't reflect that. And I can remember I was in Australia and I was searching the web, trying to figure out how long we'd been in Australia. And I found an old news release where NetLedger announced the product NetSuite. We actually announced the product before we changed the company name, and it was a
test drive.
It was a test drive. It was a huge deal to change the company name. Now it seems like a no-brainer, but then, changing a company name was a big philosophical and strategic change for the company, and obviously, we aligned all of our resources now to building a suite, not an accounting package.
If only we'd called it Cloud Suite.
Cloud Suite. NetSuite's a great name. The second major strategic change was sort of what does our customer base look like in the future? And Evan's original idea, as he mentioned, was everybody dreams these large enterprises have incredibly powerful systems to run their business. So how did you bring the power of enterprise systems down to a form factor and a price that a normal human could actually use? That was the original, I think, product architecture of the product. And in fact, I think for those of you that have run small or mid-sized businesses, it is harder to run a small or mid-sized business than it is to run a large enterprise. It's just as complicated. You look at the company Evan described that he ran before founding NetSuite. Accounting system plus support system plus website plus sales system plus keep adding these systems. It's the exact same problem that large enterprises face. So the real challenge for delivering in this marketplace was how do you create a powerful application that's easy to use? And those are the two hardest things to do in software. You can usually have a powerful application that's hard to use, or an easy-to-use application that's not very powerful. And that's the magic, I think, of what we've created at NetSuite, is an incredibly powerful app that is actually quite easy to use, and you actually do run a business. The interesting thing that's happened along the way to delivering that power and ease of use to small companies is that large companies are now calling and asking for it back. And what they're really trying to get is the agility of the small business or the mid-sized business into their organization. And I started by talking a little bit about how every company is a cloud company now. That's the disruption that's tearing apart large organizations. If you look at Coca-Cola, all of their internal systems are structured around how do you deliver giant pallets of Coca-Cola to Walmart. Their next generation business model is how do we put a soda fountain in everyone's home. That's a completely different, effectively, becoming a cloud company with machines that are calling back into Coke, telling them what consumers are doing and whatnot. That's a completely different business model. How do you enable that sort of transformation in a year, not in 5 years? And that's what you hear when you work in these large organizations. Okay, we want to try this new idea out. They call the IT department. It'll take us 3 years to get to that. That's just no way to run a modern business. In the meantime, you've got people coming in and completely disrupting your business model, whether it's banking or other things. The second thing that you obviously see happen in this notion of every company becoming a cloud company is markets that you didn't think were disruptable are suddenly being disrupted. And I hate to use the overused Uber example, but whoever thought the taxi cab industry could be disrupted, right? It's amazing what you see. Who thought that you could disrupt the hotel industry by finding all this unused inventory in people's homes? The cloud's enabling a whole different class of application, whole different class of business strategy. And now the large enterprises are trying to figure out how to Uber themselves or Groupon themselves or Airbnb themselves. Very challenging transformation to make. Part of it's got to do with strategy, but also part of it has to do with what are the systems that enable these new business models. And the systems all these companies run on were designed before you could even surf the internet. In fact, SAP and Oracle they're designed, not only do they not know the internet exists, they're actually designed to prevent access from outside that company. And no business can operate that way. Your business actually has to be accessible to your customers anytime, anywhere. And that was the basic architecture of what Evan and the team set out to build initially. And I think the thing that I'm personally proudest about in terms of how we built NetSuite was the fact that we built a distributed company very quickly. Most companies historically, you have 1,000 people in a tower, and that's how you build the company. For a variety of business reasons, we knew we had to get out of Silicon Valley very quickly, largely because when you sell to the Fortune 5 million, especially a complex business app, you have an SAP-like sale with several zeros missing off the purchase order. So the challenge becomes very quickly, how do you reduce the cost of the sale, and how do you reduce the cost of the implementation? Well, it turns out you don't do that in Silicon Valley. There's no way to reduce any cost in Silicon Valley. So when we were a very small company, we began expanding outside of Silicon Valley, and now we have thousands of people around the globe. And it's an interesting skill, and I think it's one of our big differentiators, and a key piece of IP is how do you manage a distributed company? How do you manage an organization of what we are now, 3,300 people, when only 300 of them are at headquarters? And in fact, most of the buildings that you have, the other 3,000 people are in other 300-person buildings. Part of the answer to that was we use NetSuite, right? We have a system that sort of ties all of us together. But there's, beyond systems, it's a real management skill to be able to say, I've got engineers in the Czech Republic, I've got them in Silicon Valley, and I've got them in the Philippines, and they're all working on the same project. How do you find people that can manage in that environment? It's a very important skill, I think, as you build next generation companies, and we did it very early. And I guess the final sort of strategic challenge that we faced was sort of the pre-IPO life versus the post-IPO life. Pre-IPO life, just think about even interacting with Larry, that all changed, right? In the pre-IPO life, Larry would call us, right? In the post-IPO life, we call Larry for a whole variety of reasons. So the nature of your relationships with your partners change. Certainly the nature of the relationship with your customers change. And certainly the pressures that you feel from outside, from shareholders, change. And Evan and I were talking about this as we came in. Shareholders are obviously very important. But when you yourself are a large shareholder, as Evan and I are, your focus on shareholders actually, I think, is very different than when the people running the company aren't very large shareholders. And you think about large multi-billion-dollar companies whose shares have all been distributed out to the world. It's hard to imagine a world like that where the CEO, obviously you have a fiduciary responsibility to be beholden to your shareholders. But when you're really aligned with them, as Evan and I are, I think it makes you behave in very different ways.
Yeah, well, Larry
how you run the business.
Larry was definitely always trying to get me in alignment by getting me into as much debt as possible. Oh, don't you need to redo your front yard here? His goal, he said, was to keep me in debt as deeply and as long as possible because he thought it would be highly incenting.
Well, he's well trained. He continues the debt train. But so there's many interesting things about post-IPO, and I would say the other thing I learned everybody always says after you go public, what changes and what advice would you have for a company? I think the most interesting thing post-IPO, well, there are two things. One is we were the last IPO of 2007. It was December 20th, 2007, which I don't know if you remember what happened in 2008, but being the last IPO in 2007 also meant we were the last IPO of 2008 and of 2009. So the world completely crashed after that. So timing is everything in life. But what it did tell you automatically was, it was kind of interesting to go, we went from $80 stock price to an $8 stock price. And now we've gone from an $8 stock price to a $108 stock price. First of all, I can tell you it's a lot more fun to go from 8 to 108 than it is to go from 80 to 8. But that's obvious. But secondly, the thing that you do see is it really is all about, it's not about serving the shareholders. Ultimately, success is about being true to your vision, serving the customers, and executing. And it was, in many ways, good for us to go through the crash quickly due to something that was not our responsibility, because it got us very focused very quickly on how we had to execute, what the key areas we had to execute in were. And many of the investments we made in that downturn have now become our second and third engines of growth. And it was because we had that really fine-tuned focus, because the world had crashed. We couldn't, when you're growing revenue at 40% or whatever we were at the time, you think you're a genius because all the investments you're making look like they're paying off. When suddenly growth goes from 40% to 9%, which is what happened between 2007 and 2008, you have to get really focused on what really will make growth happen in the future. And so there were many, many net positives, I think, out of the crash in terms of how we invested, in terms of how we managed the business. So it wasn't a lot of fun, but it was incredibly important. And the second thing I'd say about post-IPO is, before you go public, everyone says, make sure you have a great team in place. And so you spend all your time getting your direct reports, to be, superstars. But what you find out is after you go public, the other important team to get in place is their team. Because after you go public, everybody's job changes by about 20%. And you start to see the weakness in your direct reports, because they can't handle the step up. So the only advice I would have is not just looking at your own team, but looking at your team's team to see where the problems are going to be post-IPO. So
we take some Q&A?
Yeah, so we'll take some Q&A. I actually have it on the device here, but you can pull it up. So I like the 13-vote one. What happens after the cloud? So my belief is nothing happened. This is the last computer architecture.
Like in that, I think it was.
No, and there is. What is after the ability to access all your personal and business data anytime, anywhere, on any device? There is nothing. This is it.
Larry used to say to me, he said, I know this is the model for the next 1,000 years. I don't know what happens after 1,000 years, but this is the next 1,000.
So I truly believe this is it, right? And so the more interesting question is, what are the next generation businesses that get created because of the cloud? And that's why I think things like Uber, Groupon, Airbnb are the most interesting things, because they're creating businesses that were uncreatable before the cloud existed. And I think the key thing I take away from those businesses is the power of aggregation, data aggregation. That's really what's driving these next generation businesses. You think about LinkedIn, why is it so powerful? It's the aggregated database of everybody's resume on the planet. Who thought that you could aggregate everybody's resume on the planet? You couldn't do it before the cloud, right? And so I think as you look at, you can argue that it's not the last architecture. I really believe it is, but it is going to be the architecture it's going to last a lot longer than client-server computing did, and it's going to last a lot longer than mainframe computing did, which were the last two. So the question is, you guys shouldn't worry about what the next generation computer architecture is. You should be worrying about what you're going to do with the next generation computing architecture, because it's going to be the cloud for as long as any of you will be on Earth. And so what we're doing, I think, from a products and services standpoint, and this is where the vision thing really comes full circle, is the idea behind what Evan and Larry set out to do was build a system to run a business. That was the big idea. It wasn't delivering it over the internet. Nobody had ever built a system to run a business. Everybody, and this is still the way most people build software, is to run departments. and then you have to tie those things together. So the amazing thing about building a system to run a business is once you have your data in one place, which is effectively what NetSuite customers do, things that were really hard before become trivial. Because what's the challenge in most companies? If you want to run an e-commerce website, oh, I have to go get the order data out of the accounting system. Oh, I have to go get the customer data out of the CRM system. Oh, I have to get the marketing data out of the and then you have to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And that's the problem. It's very hard to put Humpty Dumpty back together again in a meaningful way. If you never break Humpty Dumpty up, suddenly things become trivial. And so Evan talked about, well, not trivial, Evan's would, it's not necessarily trivial.
It's a simple matter of programming.
But if you think about, we have an enormous footprint in e-commerce. Now, what company on the planet uses their ERP system as their customer-facing e-commerce system? Nobody does, except NetSuite customers. And in some ways, it's an accident of our architecture. Because early on, built a system that had your customer record, your inventory record, your marketing record, and internally, you made that thing look like a really cool business app, right, for an accountant or a salesperson. Because that data wasn't in one place, it suddenly became a display challenge, not a data aggregation challenge. Instead of making that app and that data look like a business app, let's make it look like our customer's website. And so because we built this system on the cloud and we built it differently, we have all of these capabilities that no other system has. And so I think that's sort of where we're going with products and services, is because we built this integrated system on the cloud, and suddenly you can enable businesses like Airbnb, which happens to be a customer, Vivo, which happens to be a customer speaking later. You can enable these next generation business models. And that's exactly what we're focused on with NetSuite.
So I like the first one. Do introverts not make good CEOs? That's a good question. First of all, I think it depends on the point of the life cycle of the company. And I think I was the right CEO for the company for the early years. It was a small group. I'd worked with them all before. We were mostly focused on building the right product. You can't be a complete introvert. You can't be sitting in your office or cube staring at the computer screen. But you're really dealing with a lot of internal issues, and everybody is super inspired, super motivated. As the company grows, communication externally and internally becomes incredibly important. And when I saw Zach do the first all hands meeting, which I guess, I don't know, there were probably 100 people there or something like that. And when I saw his ability to articulate the vision and get people inspired, I knew I definitely made the right choice. So I don't know whether it's CEO or not, but I think that people that are very focused on building technology and working with a close-knit team need to get a partner that can articulate their vision and help come up with the vision too. Because I think that Zach is out there in the marketplace a lot, and he can come back and feed back into us. As you can tell from listening to him, he has a lot of vision about where the industry is going and where technology and business is going. So having him out there really helps us when he brings it back and kind of tells us, some of the things he thinks we need to do next. Well,
I always say Evan could do my job. You just didn't want to do my job. And so I think plenty of introverts are CEOs. It depends what your passion is, so I think a lot of being a CEO is being passionate about what you do.
Oh, there's a good one. We talked about this. What directive did you ignore from Larry Ellison in order to achieve the success you have today? Well, Larry's an idea, fountain, and you definitely can't do them all. So he had one which we were going to do NetLedger Personal, which was going to be like your checkbook, like Quicken. And I dutifully, when he would come up with these ideas, I would get inspired but then I'd start to program it and I'd be like, maybe this is a bridge too far. So that was one idea that we forged. And I went back to him and I said, I think this is too much for us to do and it's going to be super hard to get traction. And he said, yeah, you're probably right.
And email as well. Email was building email into. We have email in the system, but actually replacing Outlook, which was definitely a bridge too far. My experience with Larry, there's two takeaways I would have. One is, I always call him belligerently consistent. He's while he has lots of ideas, he's very focused about what makes our business successful. So for 10 years, I know what he's going to talk to me about on the phone. The second observation I have about Larry when I talk to him on the phone is, in the early days, I said, okay, Larry's going to talk to me about verticals and about how big the sales force is. Okay, I'm ready. Here's what I'm going to say. And every time, no matter what I said, he would say the opposite. And so I'm like, is he just a contrarian to be a contrarian? So the next time I got on the phone with him, I'm like, here's what I would normally say. I'm going to say the opposite. And I said the opposite, and he agreed with me. So I must think about things.
This is like that Seinfeld episode. Instead of ordering the tuna salad and being scared to talk to her, you order the chicken salad and you walk right up.
Exactly. And so, it is like amazing, incredible entrepreneurs like Larry. They do think about things almost in the exact opposite way to I would consider myself sort of a normal, guy from Nebraska. So. It is. I do that now. Instead of my initial, not that my initial impulse is always wrong, but I always make sure to say, what's the opposite view of that answer? And it's pretty interesting. The opposite view is just as interesting as the one you initially have. More interesting often.
I saw an interesting question. I guess it was didn't have as many votes. So I'm ignoring customer feedback, but if we had gone, oh, there it is, it's got a few more. If you went with your initial gut idea about a web sales tool, could you have been Salesforce.com instead? And, I'm not the type of person that believes that everything happens for a reason, but I definitely think that Mark Benioff was the right person to build Salesforce.com, and that, Evan Goldberg and Zach Nelson were the right people to build NetSuite. There's a lot of incredibly complex technical problems actually from an application perspective in building, ERP, and the inventory problems are really thorny and that sort of thing. So that was a great thing. That's what I like to chew on hard problems. So that was a good thing for, me to focus on. Mark is this, kind of quintessential salesperson, so he knew what was necessary from that perspective, and I'm sure he made some really good choices as a result of that. So,
and again, I think ultimately, the founding visions this is a long-term battle, and I think, as I said in the preamble, the data you own ultimately defines how long-lived your company is going to be, and I believe we own the most important data to run a business, and Mark owns a heck of a lot of important data about running a sales force. And so, the last battle in the client server world was this whole thing of, do best of breed applications win or does the suite win? And the suite won. It was a cobbled together suite, but the suite won for a whole bunch of reasons. I think in the cloud, you're going to see a very similar battle. Is it best of breed or is it a suite? And ultimately, obviously, we're betting that the suite is the best of breed application to run a business. And it largely has to do with the fact that transactional data is tightly coupled. The web's typically good for loosely coupled stuff, right? I click an address in NetSuite and it pops a Google map and I can zoom in from outer space to see where the customer site is. That's great, but that's a one-way passing of data. Businesses are all about transactional data, which is very hard to break up. And that's why ultimately the suite wins, we think. So we shall see how it goes.
We've changed to the degree that, our original vision was kind of one system to run a business. Now, for bigger companies, that's kind of an unattainable goal. Maybe is, a guiding North Star, but really we look at kind of complexity minimization, I guess is what you'd say for bigger companies. And they might go from 12 different applications, they adopt NetSuite, and they end up with 6, and that's a huge win for them.
What do you think next?
Again, we should.
Oh, I like that one. As NetSuite gets bigger, do you think innovation will stifle? And so this is so we are building, a multi-billion-dollar company, and it is the question as a CEO you struggle with, because we've been talking about that this year. As you look around the room, and nobody at the table, including me, has ever run a billion-dollar company before. So we're like, oh my God, we have to go get these guys who have run billion-dollar companies before, and all that. That's the guy from Nebraska, the first thought. So taking the Larry Ellison view of it, which I think is actually the right way to look at it, is, the challenge all these big companies have is they have no entrepreneurs in them. And in fact, the entrepreneurs they have get crushed. And the cool thing about NetSuite is we're filled with entrepreneurs. We're filled with guys that can know how to go start new stuff. And so I actually think we are pretty well tooled for the future without, it's always great to have people that have run billion-dollar organizations, but I think it's harder to find the people that we have in NetSuite today than it is to find the guys that have done billion-dollar things. So I think we're pretty well prepared for the innovation that's coming. The other thing is we get incredible feedback from our customers. They tell us what the future is in many ways in their industry. They talk about belligerently consistent. You will always have a customer that's telling you what they need next in very loud tones. So I think that's another key thing that we have. Yeah, no, and that's great, and we certainly guides a lot of our product direction. But there's, Steve Jobs would kind of say, well, we're not going to do
testing, because we'll just kind of tell the customer give them what they want. And there is some degree to which I think a lot of, it's a combination of ideas being generated from without and ideas being generated from within. So we have, like a lot of companies have a hackathon every year where we just let people kind of self-organize into teams and come up with some great new ideas. And it does, one of the interesting things about it is we bring people from all over our development teams that are all over the world, and they get together and they bring their personal experiences and what they're interested in. And a lot of the people in Silicon Valley, we still have a big team in Silicon Valley doing product. They have friends at all these consumer companies and that are doing really cool things for the user and for personal use. And they come and they take those ideas and they bring them into the product in a business context. So, you definitely have to continue to try to, drive innovation as you grow, and it has to come from without and from within.
And I would close with one comment related to that. You talked a little bit about one of the things we're proudest about is having built a distributed company with all these resources around the planet. The other benefit of that is, you talk about how do you get the culture of NetSuite into the Czech Republic or whatever. The other cool part is that the culture of the Czech Republic or Manila comes back and alters how we run our business. And the greatest example I have is 3 years ago, we were sitting in my staff meeting doing Q4 planning, and we looked at the number of people we had to hire, and I'm like, how many? Have we ever hired anywhere close to that number of people? And they're like, no. We had to hire 300 people a quarter, and we'd done 50 people a quarter before. And I'm like, well, how the heck are we going to do this? And so I walked out in the hallway, and at the elevator was this guy named Petr, who runs our Czech development organization. And we were going to go in the Czech Republic from 20 people to maybe 200 people or something. It was a crazy, crazy growth. And I'm like, Petr, how the hell are you going to do this? And I expected the Silicon Valley answer, it's going to be hard. It's so hard to find people. I don't know. I'll do my best. And Petr said, I must. And I'm like, holy cow, you're right. It's your job. But that conversation, we now run our business by must. We have 5 musts, because we have so much we could do. But what are the 5 things we have to do this year? And so that one conversation with a guy with a Czech attitude, not a Silicon Valley attitude, fundamentally transformed how we run the business. So it's
and all cool. The employees of NetSuite have Petr to thank for that.
Well, cool. Well, I think we're done. One more question? We'll just close on that, maybe. Thanks all for your time. We're going to host the reception tonight. We are hiring 2,000 people next year, so all right. Thanks.